Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on disaster preparedness and recovery. It is our last webinar of the year, and we have a great webinar planned for you today with three great dynamic speakers who are subject matter experts in their field. So get ready to be amazed. My name is Linda Williams. I am a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action, and I am coming to you live from the Windy City. No, not Chicago, from Fontana, California, where the Santa Anas are getting up to 50 miles per hour. Before we get into today's presentation, I need to go over a few housekeeping tips with you. I need to introduce you to consumer action and also to review the agenda with you. But before I get into that, I need to tell you that today's webinar is made possible with funding from Consumer Action Insurance Project, which you will hear a little bit more about later in the presentation. As the announcer stated, when you join the webinar, you are in listen only mode. However, you can use the question function at the right of your screen to type in your questions. Please take a few minutes, find the function, click on it, open it up so you are ready to go. If you're on Twitter, you can use that platform to ask your questions. Our organization's handle is at Consumer Action, or you can use our go-to hashtag, which is CA Webinars. My colleague, Nelson Santiago, will facilitate the question and answer segment following our feature presentation. Now, the webinar is being recorded. It will be made available to you tomorrow afternoon via Dropbox. At the end of the training, you will receive a survey about today's webinar. Those surveys are so important to us, so please complete the survey before signing off the webinar. Now, let me introduce you to Consumer Action. What do we do at CA? As it says under the screen, under Welcome to Consumer Action, through education and advocacy, Consumer Action fights for strong consumer rights and policies that promote fairness and financial prosperity for underrepresented consumers nationwide. How do we do that? Consumer Action advances consumer rights nationwide by referring complaints through our national hotline, by publishing educational materials in multiple languages, through our monthly newsletter, The Insider, our Scamgram, our quarterly publication, CA News, and by advocating for consumers in the media and before lawmakers. Now, another important function of CA is its outreach. Nelson, Jamie, Wu, and I are constantly reaching out to community based organizations that serve low to moderate income and marginalized communities to engage them, to teach them how to use the educational materials that we create so they can help their clients reach their financial goals, and by providing trainings like today's webinar. We have a full house today, and since some of you are new to consumer action, I thought I would just take a couple of minutes to show you how you can download our free materials from our website. Let's say you are seeing more identity theft cases since COVID hit more than usual, and you're interested in a training module on ID theft. Go to our website. The address is on all of the documents that you received from us, and it's at the bottom of the screen there. When you're on our website, go to the quick menu, click training modules, scroll down to ID theft and account fraud, click, and voila. You will be led to a list of publications that we've created on identity theft that you can download for free. Now, if you're interested in our COVID-19 educational project, just click on the dark green bar on the screen and you will land on that page. Now, while you're on the website, if you type in Insurance Education Project, you will land on our Insurance Education Project page. There you will find multilingual brochures, question and answer guides, presentation slides, and just added to the site is our updated disaster coverage fact sheet that alerts consumers to the risk of losing their homes and possessions in a disaster, and it stresses the importance of purchasing adequate uh, insurance. So, um, Consumer Action is a 501c3 organization. We are supported by donations and grants. And at the end of the presentation, at the end of the training, I will tell you how you can donate to Consumer Action. But first, let's take a look at our agenda. At Consumer Action, we believe in making learning fun. So we open up each and every training by testing your knowledge on the topic of the training with our most popular game, How Much Do You Know? So today we have 4 true and false poll questions that we hope will engage you, and then you will participate in the game as well. Following the game, I will introduce you to our guest speakers. Our first guest speaker is Meghan Smolensky. She's an attorney with Lone Star Legal Aid in Texas. She will be followed by Miss Kendall Jarvis, who is a disaster relief attorney here in California, fighting those Northern California wildfires, followed by a presentation by Miss Jeanne Ortiz. Ms. Ortiz is an attorney with Pro Bono Net, who will take us on a live tour of valuable resources that you will need and you don't want to miss it. That will be followed by a question and answer session led by Nelson Santiago. I will come back, tell you how you can donate $5, $10, $15 to Consumer Action, and then we will wrap up. So let the game begin. Okay, Steve Harvey, launch the first poll question, please. Insurance coverage for loss of use, also known as additional living expenses or coverage D, pays for the extra cost of living elsewhere while your house is uninhabitable. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Is it true or is it false? One more second, couple more seconds. Okay, let's close it. Let's see the results. Well, 80% of you think that's true? Really? 80% you think that's true? 20% you think is false? Well, that's true. Let's launch the next poll question. While mud flow and mudslides are different incidents, they are both covered by flood insurance. Is that true or is that false? While mud flow and mudslides are different incidents, they are both covered by flood insurance. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close it. So 17% thinks it's true and 83% think it's false. Well, 83%, you are correct. That is false. Let's launch the next question. The average renter insurance policy costs $15 per month or $180 per year. $15 a month? Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close it. Let's see the results. 84% thinks it's true and only 16% thinks it's false. That is actually true, which is really important while we encourage our clients to include renters insurance in their budget. Okay, let's launch the last poll question. For homeowners and renters who have personal insurance, FEMA provides grants to cover the insurance deductible. Is that true or is that false? For homeowners and renters who have personal insurance, FEMA provides grants to cover the insurance deductible. Is that true or is that false? Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so 42% is saying it's true, 58% is saying it's false. That is actually false. Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for participating in the game and playing along with us. So let's get to our featured presentation and let's introduce you to our guest speakers. Our first guest speaker is Miss Meghan Smolensky. She is an Equal Justice Work Fellow in the Disaster Resilience Program at Lone Star Legal Aid in Houston, Texas. This program helps victims of natural disaster through assistance with a multitude of legal matters. Prior to joining Lone Star, Meghan was a part of the Disaster Recovery Legal Corps and assisted with the repair and mitigation efforts for Hurricane Harvey. She is a 2017 graduate of South Texas College of Law. She holds a bachelor's degree, Bachelor of Arts degree from Louisiana State University, LSU. Our next speaker is Miss Kendall Jarvis. Miss Jarvis is currently the Disaster Relief Attorney for Legal Aid of Sonoma County. In this position, Ms. Jarvis helped survivors of the 2017 Northern California wildfires address the significant legal challenges they face in the aftermath of a disaster. Such legal issues can include FEMA, insurance, housing, employment, construction, and many more. Before becoming a disaster relief attorney for Legal Aid of Sonoma County, Ms. Jarvis received her Juris Doctorate and Masters of Law from Empire College of Law, where she graduated at the top of her graduating class. While in law school, Ms. Jarvis volunteered as a law clerk for Legal Aid of Sonoma County and as a mediator for the Sonoma County courts. Prior to law school, she received her mediation certificate from the University of California at Berkeley and her Bachelor of Arts degree in Law and Society from the University of California, where she graduated with honors. Our next speaker is Ms. Jeanne Ortiz. Ms. Ortiz is the Pro Bono and Strategic Initiative Manager at Pro Bono Net. Pro Bono Net is a national nonprofit dedicated to building innovative technology tools for nonprofit legal service organizations and pro bono attorneys. In the wake of the 2017 major national disasters, Ms. Ortiz served as Pro Bono's Disaster Response Legal Fellow and volunteered as a disaster legal assistance attorney for survivors affected by Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. She is a volunteer for the American Bar Association Disaster Legal Service Program, where she helped coordinate immediately and free temporary legal help to disaster survivors across the country. In 2020, she was appointed to a 3-year term as a member of the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Disaster Preparedness and Response and became an affiliate of the New York City Bar Association Pro Bono and Legal Service Committee. She is bilingual and she is admitted to practice law in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. You go, girl. I told you, get ready to be amazed. Let me turn this presentation over to
Hello, everybody. It's Meghan Smolensky, and all right, we're ready to rock and roll. So just a little bit of background on the disasters that I worked with. So in Houston, Texas, from about 2016 to 2017, we had around 3 major hurricanes, which caused huge amount of floodings back to back. So in April 2016 and then May 2016. And then, of course, everyone knows about Hurricane Harvey, which happened around August, September in 2017. And just to give a little perspective, about 1 trillion gallons of water fell across Harris County over a period of 4 days. And it's, one of the biggest disasters the United States has ever had to deal with. So that's kind of where my experience began, and it was such a large disaster that, things were fairly new at the time, so we've learned a lot since then. All right. So I just wanted to kind of give a background on when a disaster strikes, how the emergency management cycle begins. And so obviously you have your immediate response when a disaster hits, and that's primarily focused on your first responder and other, officers being able to reach people and, try to provide some sort of safety to them, especially with flooding in our area. It's people just get stuck in their homes and it is so dangerous. So that immediate response is so important. And then once, the waters recede and people start making their way back to their homes, you hit the recovery stage. And that's when you see FEMA come in your damage assessments. And then once more time passes, you get your mitigation efforts. And this usually comes when funding is provided either from state or federal levels, and your local governments work to see what problems can be mitigated before the next disaster, which was huge with Hurricane Harvey. And then preparedness. You know, hurricane season always so huge in the South, and now more than ever after Hurricane Harvey, we see preparedness being so important because so many people just weren't prepared for a hurricane the size of Harvey and of that magnitude. So our biggest effort now is just to prepare everyone in our community to know what you can do and what your protections are when a hurricane hits, and how you can make you and your family whole again. All right. Okay, so once the disaster hits, so we're still kind of in that response phase, the American Red Cross is probably one of the first organizations that's going to start reacting and setting up shelters within your area. And I know we have a lot of attendees from many different organizations, and not just legal organizations like myself, but I'm sure organizations who deal with client relations. And so this is just good information for you to have with your clients and how you can direct them once an emergency hits. The other important information is 211, and 211 is huge, not only during a disaster but after. It's a great resource. 211 here in Texas is directly connected with our local government, and so any new information that the local government is putting out, 211 will be aware of. So it's just a really good resource to tell your clients for immediate information that they can just be dialing in. I mean, obviously, I know it's hard, especially with hurricanes when power lines go down, but the reality is it's just hard to get information out once these disasters strike. So these are just some good resources for you and your clients, family members, whomever to have. And of course, you know, check your local news. Obviously, they're going to be the ones who have the most accurate / most immediate information. So once a disaster hits, the first thing that we see is called DRCs, which are so important. They're disaster recovery centers. And just like the American Red Cross site, they're going to be shelters all across your area. And this is huge because it's where a lot of these local organizations will meet to start providing immediate assistance. So Lone Star Legal Aid, where I am housed, when Hurricane Harvey hit, we immediately sent people to these DRCs to start getting the word out about FEMA, just how to get information of different resources that they might need. So this is huge. It's also where you're going to start to see FEMA being housed. And, you know, depending on whether it's declared a presidential disaster, FEMA will show up at these DRCs and start, you know, setting up their tables and resources, and this can be the beginning stages of you filing, you know, appeals or initial applications with FEMA. So very important to know where your DRCs are. Again, most local news sites, 211 will know where these DRCs are being housed. And also important, Red Cross shelters also often transition to FEMA DRCs. So, you know, it makes no sense to, once you have these shelters, to completely start over and, you know, make new ones at different locations, especially where the majority of people are already being housed. So there's very, very rarely a change in location. So that's kind of, it's nice, but also important, so you can direct your clients to these same places where they know there'll be resources will be provided. Okay, so legal needs after disaster. And I know that not everyone on this call is from a legal aid or legal organization, but I think it's so important to make your clients aware of, you know, there's going to be different issues the longer a natural disaster progresses. I used to have a boss who said for every one disaster or one legal issue, there are going to be 7 more following it. And it's true, because yeah, you might have some immediate issues with your housing right away, but then give it a couple months and you're going to have a FEMA issue. Give it a couple months and you're going to have a contractor issue. It's terrible how ongoing it is, and it's terrible how long these disasters will affect your life, but unfortunately, it's just the reality of the situation. especially after Hurricane Harvey, which was a natural disaster of such magnitude. You know, it's what, 2020, and we're still seeing damage from Hurricane Harvey, and people are still not made whole yet. So it's just something to be aware of, you know, how long these legal needs will affect your life. So just to review the list, I'm not going to go through each one, but you know, usually after your 1 to 6 week period, you're going to see housing issues, you're going to see lease terminations, evictions, utility shut-offs. You know, landlords just want you out of their space. They want to start repairing it. You know, it's a slow process. And then you're going to see your FEMA applications, which is huge, and I'll get to that. Your document replacement, your unemployment, public benefits, your SBA loans. So that's kind of the immediate aftermath. And then you're going to go to your 1 to 6 months. You're going to see your FEMA appeals, your landlord tenant issues. Those seem to go on for forever, unfortunately. Let's see what else. Foreclosure issues, Section 8, you know, power of attorney, guardianships. It just, you know, see what I'm saying? There's so many things that you wouldn't expect for a disaster to lead to, but unfortunately it does. And so that's kind of, it's good to be educated on the possible scenarios that you and your clients might face. Okay. So FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. Complicated relationship with a lot of disaster legal aid attorneys. We love it when they help us, but it's also kind of hard to get that help. So hopefully some of the tips and tricks that Kendall and I talk about today can maybe save you some pain. So this is the timeline of how FEMA assistance works. So disaster strikes, governor requests a disaster declaration from the president. President declares a disaster, and then FEMA assistance is made available. So that's something to be mindful of, because not every disaster will get a disaster declaration. And sometimes it's that waiting in between to see whether or not your disaster in your area will even get FEMA assistance. I believe maybe a year ago we had some flooding in South Texas, and it was a good 2 weeks before any federal declaration was made. So people were kind of thinking, will they, won't they? But you know, it just depends, and sometimes it takes longer than others. So here's just some important laws and guidance that I want to include in the presentation, which I know will be made available to everyone. The biggest thing is the CFR and the Robert T. Stafford Act, which kind of is the basis of where FEMA gets their laws and guidance and assistance, and so that's really important. And then the other important piece of authority I'll say is the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which does reform some of the policies made in those previous, you know, acts, and you know, some benefits that are now given that weren't previously made. So also just, you know, good to have, good to look over. So those are there. Okay, FEMA process, what we're all here for. So when the disaster strikes, and this is just a very general view of it, so you're going to apply for FEMA. Within that time period, you're going to have an inspector visit. Now, obviously, because of COVID, things are a little bit different. Now, these inspector visits have gone virtual, which is very interesting. Then, ideally, you'll get a FEMA determination. If you get denied, you'll have to appeal, so you'll have that appeal period, the appeals decision, and then a possible recoupment period. So, again, very broad general view. Not every application is going to go this way, but if you know you are denied, this is kind of your pathway, and I'll get to the specifics. So how do you apply for FEMA? This is huge, because once the disaster hits, you need to make your clients aware of how they can, you know, seek help and assistance on applying. The biggest way I always see is online. It's really easy to you just go to disasterassistance.gov, you can apply there or through a smartphone. They have the telephone number or in person at the DRCs, as previously mentioned, because FEMA always will set up some kind of tent or table at those DRCs. Now, the biggest, I don't want to say issue, but problem that we've seen is clients are not aware that you have 60 days after the disaster declaration was made to initially apply for FEMA. We have a lot of people who are like, well, I didn't think I'd qualify, or I didn't know that, and so they missed that application period. And I'm not saying it's the end of the road. It just, the quicker you get your application in, the quicker a decision can be made. So who can apply? Also huge. So only U.S. citizens, non-citizen nationals, or qualified aliens may be eligible for assistance. That being said, one of the most common denials that we can get is that you were not, your application was denied because you didn't qualify. But if another adult household member meets the eligibility criteria and certifies their citizenship status, then that is another way that maybe your application can get in. So maybe you have a parent or guardian of a minor child who is a U.S. citizen, or let's say you're the parent or legal guardian who isn't a U.S. citizen, and your child is. Then you can put the application in their name and be a co-applicant and still register with FEMA that way. So again, it's just finding little ways to get through to FEMA and not let their denial process hinder you. But again, there is certain status requirement, citizenship, status requirements. All right, so once you apply to FEMA, you have the right to receive individual assistance. So within that individual assistance, there's different categories. And then just a few. So you have the individuals and household program, which is probably the most important one you're going to see on this list, because it provides financial assistance and direct services to those who have uninsured or underinsured necessary expenses. And so that's where you're going to start seeing the money that you'll need to help repair your home from the damage, or to reimburse you for the items that you've lost. Then what we see a lot is the disaster unemployment assistance, which obviously provides unemployment benefits to survivors. And then just you can rate on the list. You see disaster legal services, mass care and emergency assistance program, disaster case management, and crisis counseling assistance and training programs. So these are some of the individual assistance programs that are available. All right. So under the individuals and household program, there's kind of two branches that go down for which you can potentially receive money for. So we'll have the housing assistance and then the other needs assistance. So under housing, that's where you have your financial assistance for rental, repair, replacement. Those are pretty huge, and these are the financial assistance that I see the most of that my clients are requesting. And then your other needs assistance. So that's where you see your personal property, your moving and your storage, and then your funeral, medical, dental, childcare, and other miscellaneous items. Now, this is kind of confusing, but under the other needs assistance, there's two categories within that. So you have the SBA dependent category. And so what this means is, in order to qualify for this assistance, you'll have to apply for the SBA loan. And what my organization always recommends to our clients is just to go ahead and apply for that SBA loan. You might get denied. Even if you qualify, doesn't mean you have to accept it, but one of FEMA's formalities is that you have to apply for this SBA loan for them even to consider giving you some sort of benefit. So what we always tell our clients is go ahead, just automatically apply. Doesn't mean you have to take it. Doesn't even mean you're gonna, qualify for it. So that's kind of the differentiation between those two. All right, so here's just some different categories, under the housing assistance for financial assistance for housing. So then here we see your lodging expense reimbursement, which is financial assistance, reimbursement for hotels, motels, or other short-term lodging. This is very important, especially for your clients, to keep those receipts, because you do have to recertify. I want to say every 2 months, but I could be wrong. But you do have to continue recertifying in order to get those reimbursements. You have your rental assistance, which is financial assistance to rent alternative housing accommodations while an applicant is displaced. So, it's pretty self-explanatory, but if you or your client have to rent an apartment while your house is being fixed, you could apply for rental assistance. Repairs, obviously with Hurricane Harvey, people's houses were completely wiped out, and so you see residents who need either a complete regutting of their home, and so this could fall under the repair category, or replacement, which the residence is completely destroyed and you need the financial means to completely rebuild your home. Okay, so tips and tricks when dealing with FEMA for housing assistance. So FEMA assistance is meant to only repair the house to minimum living condition. So unfortunately, the assistance is not meant to make you whole. So the money that you get from FEMA will rarely ever put your house into the position that it was before any kind of damage, which is unfortunate. It's just only meant to make it livable. And unfortunately, we see a lot of FEMA applications being denied because FEMA states that the house is already in livable condition. And I can tell you from experience, these houses are not. So the line that FEMA is using to determine what a person's house is livable is very low. So that's just something to keep in mind. But if no suitable housing is available, FEMA can demolish your existing home and build you a new one and provide a FEMA trailer. See a lot of trailers after disaster. So what's the minimum requirements for home replacement? Home was destroyed by the disaster, no insurance coverage, repairs not feasible, and replacement necessary for occupants' health or safety. We see a lot of mold after these hurricanes or floods, and so that could potentially contribute to affecting someone's health or safety. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so FEMA provides rental assistance for people who were displaced by the disaster. Usually up front you receive rental assistance for 1 to 2 months, and then you have to submit receipts to FEMA to get more rental assistance. Keep copies of all your leases and receipts, because FEMA will absolutely ask you to provide some sort of proof of payment and some sort of proof that you were living somewhere in order to get reimbursed for rental assistance. The number one thing I always tell my clients is keep everything, because FEMA gives you money. They have the absolute right to ask for receipts, leases, rental payments, money orders, checks. They want copies of everything to see that their money is being used for what they told you could use it for. And just here, there's just other different housing assistance, direct assistance. You have the multi-family lease and repair program, direct lease, permanent housing construction. So FEMA does have a lot of programs that your clients could be using or apply to, and hopefully something that FEMA has can help provide some kind of assistance. So the other type of assistance that FEMA offers is the other needs assistance. So the IHP provides assistance to individual and households affected by a disaster to enable them to address necessary expenses and serious needs which can't be met through other forms of disaster assistance or insurance. So that means it can't be, you're not going to get any reimbursement through this SBA loans or what other kind of insurance you have. But other needs assistance is sometimes administered partly by the state where the disaster occurs, or sometimes it could be administered by the federal government. It just depends on what your state you live in. Also, something that is very important, you don't have to file a separate application for other needs assistance. You have one application with FEMA and they're going to qualify you for both other needs assistance and individual households, or you might be denied from both, or one or the other. But just a reminder, one and only application. Okay, and kind of like I mentioned before, other needs assistance is SBA dependent. Only applicants who do not qualify for a loan from the SBA may be eligible for assistance. So that's why, again, we tell our clients, go ahead and always just apply for that SBA loan. Some more tips and tricks. So funds must be used the way FEMA tells you to, pretty obvious. Unfortunately, we do see a lot of, well, FEMA gave me, like, let's say I had a client who's $12,000 and he had a big credit card bill and he used that money to pay off that credit card bill. Not great. And if you do get audited, they will find that out. So just, you know, always keep reminding your clients of this. Again, this is money you use to replace destroyed household items, clothes, damaged appliances, etc. Make an itemized list of everything that was destroyed. That's huge. FEMA's going to want that. They're going to want a list of what was destroyed from your home, possibly, well, no, not possibly, how much it cost, just to see what they will reimburse you for these items. FEMA will only give transportation assistance if all household vehicles are destroyed. You know, again, that's pretty terrible, but if just one of your cars is destroyed, not all, you know, you might not get all that money. Okay, so another part of the other needs, so non-SBA dependent, which again mean you don't need to apply for that SBA loan, includes funeral, medical, dental, childcare, and assistance for miscellaneous items. So this could be huge. We've seen a lot of, you know, medical assistance, dental assistance, and so you could get money without having to apply for that SBA loan. Okay, so critical needs assessment, I won't go too into this, but just an immediate payment to cover immediate needs. Hurricane Harvey, we saw that where a lot of households just got the $500, which was a one-time payment to, you know, they could be used in whatever way was necessary in order to, you know, kind of help them out right when that disaster happened. Okay, so duplication of benefits. So FEMA won't give you funds for something if you've already got money for it. So did your insurance cover your damages? Is this your home where you actually live? Has some other program, charity fixed the property? But I will say, just because you have insurance does not mean that you might not get money from FEMA. And that's one of the common denial reasons that we see is they see that you have private insurance and so they don't want to give you extra money. But there's ways around it, which I'll go into a little bit, but yet those insurance estimates should get some kind of itemized list of damages, you know, just to show them that just because you got this this money does not mean that your house will be made like completely repaired, or that you still have a lot of damage that needs to be repaired. So don't let these words stop you just because you have insurance. You know, there's ways around it, but I'll get a little bit more into that later. Okay, so the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. So this is just a little overview of, like I said, some of the changes that were made, and they on or after September 1st, 2017. The biggest thing I wanted to talk was other needs assistance and housing assistance come from separate pots of money. So you could technically get an amount to repair your home and another amount to replace your lost personal property. Now, this was $34,900 for 2019. That amount will change each year based on inflation, but that's really great because you're not having to, dig from the same pot. You could really, get a lot of money from FEMA if you qualify. And then this is just state control of some FEMA IHP resources. So state can administer some categories of housing assistance, sometimes FEMA, it just depends. But state can administer other needs assistance or leave it up to FEMA. But again, state by state basis, and it depends on the disaster. Okay, so appeals. Once you have that initial 60-day period in which you have done your initial application, you will receive some kind of letter in the mail stating whether your application was accepted or denied. And let's say you've been denied, and there's many reasons why FEMA will deny you. Like I said before, they'll declare it livable. They'll say you don't have ownership. You don't have the right citizenship status. It could be many things. You have 60 days from the date of that denial to write your appeal. That being said, if you don't make it within those 60 days, please, 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 please tell you and your clients still write that appeal. FEMA does require some kind of good cause to show that why you were late, but I rarely see applications not accepted because they were outside of that 60-day period. Especially with Hurricane Harvey, it was such a crazy time and people didn't know about the 60 days, or they let it lapse, or they weren't living where the house was and that's where it was sent. They were in the hospital. All great reasons to show good cause. But if you don't have one, just go ahead and tell your client to send it in. The worst they can do is deny you once again, and you'll just go from there. And just because you're denied once doesn't mean you can't fight that appeal again. You can try as many times as they'll let you. So I always tell my clients, you gotta be a little tenacious. Don't let FEMA get you down. You gotta keep going. So this is a big slide, common reasons for denial of FEMA assistance. Applicant's insurance covers the damage caused loss, eligible for other forms of disaster assistance, didn't have flood insurance as required by FEMA, damage sustained to the property are not sufficient, FEMA is unable to verify the damaged home ownership or occupancy status, finds that the damage to the home were not found to be caused by the disaster, or damaged property is a vacation home or secondary home. So those are just some common denial reasons that we see. So again, FEMA appeal deadline, 60 days, but just keep trying. One other thing, though, I do want to mention is if FEMA does not respond within 90 days, then the appeal will be considered to be denied. But you should always still call the helpline and try to discuss your appeal with a FEMA agent. So how do you make a good FEMA appeal? And here's just and there are some requirements that FEMA does require for each appeal, but a good FEMA appeal, applicant's full name, FEMA application number and disaster number. Every disaster is going to get a different disaster number. Address of the pre-disaster primary residence, current phone number and address, and then last 4 digits of the applicant's social security number. So this is just, they need these identifiers in order for these appeals to be readable, FEMA will appreciate it. You know, maybe they'll like it so much they'll give you everything you ask for, but just, you know, it's good to have all these identifiers on each page. It just makes it easier. So if someone other than the applicant is filing the appeal, then the applicant must include a signed statement. So for those attorneys out there, even though you're filing an appeal on behalf of your client, they're still going to need a signed statement to authorize you filing that appeal. The appeal must include the words "I appeal" or some variation, the reason for the appeal and any law that supports that reason, and documentation and pictures to prove the statements. That's huge, 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 is to show FEMA any proof you can possibly supply them with will make this appeals process, you know, so much stronger for you and your client. I don't want to say it makes it easier, but the more you can show them, you know, you have to try to put out as many documentation and pictures to prove that appeal. And then lastly, you have to do the following statements. I declare under penalty of perjury that the information provided is true. So this is just, you know, contents of a good FEMA appeal. So here's some tips. How did your client register? If they registered by phone, you know, on the website, it just depends. That's how they can kind of check the status of the application. Keep everything updated all the time. Inform FEMA of any address changes, regularly check mail. Have your client document everything. Take pictures during the disaster if you can, after, any damaged items, when you're gutting the house. You know, just any kind of before and afters would be great, but even more so just pictures of the actual damage. Okay. Oh, and I just did want to mention one other thing is for homes, you do need a contractor estimate. They're going to ask for an itemized list for documentation that says it was flood damage and the repairs that are needed. So that's huge when you're doing these appeals. And then the other denial reason we see all the time is proof of ownership. A lot of homes of my clients, they're family homes, so they belong to their parents, their grandparents, and title was never transferred. There was no probate done, and this is one of the biggest reasons that FEMA will deny your application. So, you know, this is where more legal sides of things come in, but ownership documents are huge, and it can create some problems with getting that FEMA money down the line. So something to look into, most definitely. And each state has different document requirements. So we have something in Texas called the affidavit of heirship. Not all states have that. So, you know, just look at your state and what kind of documents FEMA will allow in order to show some kind of ownership. Okay. Now, inspector issues, FEMA inspectors. So like I said, once you do that initial application, you'll see a FEMA inspector. I've got to be honest, often little to no training. They're just people who, once disaster hit, FEMA hires a whole bunch, says here are some guides, manuals, learn them, go out to these people's houses and do these inspections. So you're not talking about some professional contractors by any means. Now there's limits on where they can go. They can't go on the roof or under the house, which especially with, you know, wind damage, flooding, it's just so limited and they're inconsistent. One inspector might say you have X amount of dollars and then the other might say you have zero damage at all. So it's all over the board. But what I will say is if you are denied after that initial application, you can always request a second inspection. So you got the money, now what? Like I said, keep the receipts. FEMA can audit you at any time if they wish. Like I said, use the money for what FEMA told you. Don't pay off those credit card bills. Yeah, sure, you got a nice pot of gold, but you know, you got to use it to repair your home. That being said, we see a lot of contractor fraud issues come up down the line where people give their entire FEMA check to these contractors and you never see them again. You know, advise your clients, don't do this. Sign contracts with these people, you know, installments, give them, you know, some money out front, some when the job is complete. I just can't tell you how many times people get like $35,000 worth of money from FEMA and it's all gone because they just write the check over. Here's just some more helpful links for you that you can come back and revisit. Okay, and then just want to go quickly, relationship building with other organizations, BOAD, COADs. So BOADs, voluntary organizations, oops, excuse me. Voluntary organizations active in a disaster. These groups voluntarily help survivors after disaster. Serves as a forum for members and partner organizations to share knowledge and resources. So this is huge. I will say what I'm still a part of is the long-term recovery group. It's a collaborative network. We're talking emergency management, government organization, legal aid organizations, nonprofit, and we still meet once a month, especially with COVID. A different disaster, different set of problems, but you know, we've already formed this network, which is huge. So we already have these resources in place. So when another disaster happens, we're kind of already in place to kind of, you know, try to get things rolling. FEMA voluntary agency liaison works with the community, usually works with the long-term recovery organization. So that's where you can find them. And then last but certainly not least, you have the American Bar Association Disaster Legal Services. Through the Young Lawyers Division, they will have a network that once a disaster hits, they usually do a national hotline. They have a group of organizations that meet on sometimes a daily basis, then weekly, then monthly after a disaster strikes, and they're getting together all these immediate temporary legal assistance to survivors. So they're a great resource, and I highly recommend everyone check out that site. And then, you know, this is attorney specific, but we're talking pro bono referrals. Once you get that disaster, of course, everyone wants to help. And then, you know, you have all these pro bono attorneys kind of itching to help. And then as time goes by, you know, not so many, but, you know, try to get that continued support, that recruitment. So down the line, even now, when there's cases that need to be taken, you can, you know, have those pro bono referrals. So I know that was a lot of information. You know, thank you for listening to me, and I hope some of it will be useful to y'all in the future.
Thank you, Megan. Let me get Ms. Jarvis in here. I'm just going to click on her so you both have the mic now.
Okay.
Okay.
So I don't have control over the keyboard.
You should have control. You should have control. Try it again.
I do not.
One more time.
Now it looks like I might. Nope.
There you go.
Okay. So small technical difficulties. We're all used to that now in this remote lifestyle we're living in. We've seen more remote technical difficulties than we care to. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Megan. So as Linda said earlier, my name is Kendall Jarvis, and I'm the disaster relief attorney for Legal Aid of Sonoma County. Legal Aid of Sonoma County is a nonprofit organization that helps individuals potentially, or especially the most vulnerable individuals in our community, have access to legal justice. And we have a variety of programs. The disaster relief team is just a piece of that puzzle. But the disaster relief team was started in 2017 after the Northern California wildfires. Since that time, we had a declared disaster, a flood the following year, and then a declared fire the year after that, and then this year so far we've had 3 individually federally declared fires in our county. So needless to say, disasters are an increasing instance in California, and I know that that is not something that is only true of California, but unfortunately has become true throughout the United States. So what we do now is basically help with any issues related to recovery that come up in the disaster setting, whether that be a fire or a flood, and quite frankly, or something like COVID, which is also a declared disaster on a state and federal level. So what is a disaster? That is a big question. We use the word disaster often. We think of it as something that we see on the news, unless or until it's something that impacts our community. And the reality of what a disaster is sort of varies based on where you are. We have different kinds of disasters in different areas of the country, let alone in different areas of the world, right? In the United States, because of the layers of help and assistance, the meaning of what a disaster is really matters. So your local government could declare a state of emergency based on a disaster. Your state government can declare a state of emergency based on a disaster. And or the federal government can declare that your state has suffered a federally declared disaster. And the reason that's important is because depending on who qualifies the event as a disaster determines what kind of help and assistance is going to become available. So Meghan talked a lot about what it means to be in a federally declared disaster. Harvey was very obviously a federally declared disaster. There were over 1 million people that purely registered with FEMA, which is a huge, huge number. If you look at something like the 2017 wildfires in Northern California, or even the 2018 wildfires in Butte, while those events were incredibly devastating for property and life, we had much smaller numbers in terms of the people that registered. So in 2017 in Sonoma County, we had about 20,000 people that registered with FEMA. And in 2018 in Butte County, they had, I believe, around 80,000 people that registered. So which they're all disasters, right? But there's a big difference between the 20,000 to the 80,000 to the 1 million people. So one thing that's important is to sort of view the event in terms of what that means, right? Well, if only my local government declares something as a disaster, there's not going to be a lot of assistance available. And the reason for that is because, generally speaking, local governments are not adequately equipped to deal with disaster response on their own. Similarly, on a state level, while we would think, okay, well, that's bigger, that would be more helpful, there is a better disaster response plans, and that's improved a lot in the past 10 years, but still, there's not a lot of state infrastructure and state financial capabilities that allows the state to, A, respond to the disaster in terms of the emergency needs of life, limb, that kind of thing, versus the recovery aspect. So when we get a federal declaration, that's the point at which there actually opens up larger funding opportunities through FEMA, both for literally, your state and local government to hire people to assist in the response, but then also, as Meghan talked about, the individual assistance piece, where an individual survivor can have access to grant funding, can have access to disaster unemployment, can have access to medical support financially, and things that we just really see become a very, very big deal. This has been a major issue in California over the years because disasters on a federal level are generally viewed in terms of what the damage is, how many lives were lost and or injuries, but also whether the event itself was, how the event itself was viewed, I should say. And wildfires are a newer event that has been brought into that disaster definition. Generally speaking, that was not true historically because they were not viewed as basically a defined disaster. That's changed, but the reason this is important is because the federal government generally defines a disaster based on the amount of damage resulting or loss of life from one weather event. So it has to be seen as one weather event for the federal government to view it as part of the valuation of those damages. And without that individual assistance grant, you are going to have a hard time helping your community recover. You can do a lot to try and, you know, work them through the process, but you end up in a place where at the end of the day, if you are trying to address the needs of people that do not have insurance, it is going to be very difficult to address those needs without federal support. So this segues into problems faced in rural areas. So Sonoma County is a semi-rural area. We're close to San Francisco, so a large city, so people don't often think of us that way, but realistically, we're relatively rural. And quite frankly, the major impact of most disasters ends up being in rural or semi-rural areas because they have a much harder time of coping with the disaster as it unfolds, both with the response, I mean, literally either from topographical perspectives, meaning that it's literally hard to, you know, protect people, stop the wildfire in certain cases, things like that, but also because there just isn't as much money available in these kind of situations. And the more rural you are, the less likely you are to have insurance. So the combined reality of those circumstances leads to additional challenges that people face in rural and semi-rural areas. These challenges lead to basically a conclusion that there is significant disparity in disaster recovery. There have been some studies done about this, quite frankly, not as many as I would think that there should be, but until really around 2015, disasters weren't frequent enough in the same location that people weren't pushed to sort of prepare for the next event. And that has really shifted. So prior, it seemed like the anomaly, right? We all saw it on television. We all donated to those kinds of causes. We all felt horrible for people impacted, but you didn't consistently see one community being impacted time and time again by a similar disastrous event. That's changed, which has sort of changed what we're highlighting about what disaster recovery means and what disparities occur as part of that disaster recovery. And a lot of those disparities can be connected to, as we said, one, the fact that they often occur in rural and semi-rural areas, but also other factors that come into play, such as pre-existing income inequality, the demographic of the impacted population, the lack of response and recovery infrastructure, the lack of access to legal protection, and really the inability to safely and affordably gain access to stable housing. And when I say stable housing, I don't just mean that people need access to a home to be rehoused literally, but that housing has to be something that they can maintain. And in the wake of a disaster, when you're in a rural or semi-rural area, you don't have a lot of vacancies. You're generally in a situation where you're fighting for the housing that is left over. So the cost of housing goes up, which means if I was a renter before and now I'm trying to rent again, someone may view me as a renter, and if I re-rent, they're thinking that, okay, I'm recovered because I'm rehoused. Well, what if my rent pre-disaster was $1,000 a month, and post-disaster, I now have to pay $2,000 a month? If I can't afford to maintain that $2,000 a month payment, I'm not stably rehoused. And that is something that we see consistently in disasters, because the reality of the post-disaster scenario aggravates those sort of pre-existing disparities that we all know exist before, but they get highlighted in circumstances where disasters really demonstrate a significant impact on certain aspects of a population. As we said, one of those being those with pre-existing income inequalities or pre-existing sectors of the community from a demographic perspective that just have a more challenging time accessing recovery. And when we think of those with traditional sort of demographic struggles. It would be those that were low income, disabled, elderly, non-citizens, or especially those not lawfully in the United States. But those disparities become more problematic because they provide barriers to basically not just housing, but almost every step of the recovery process. So, for example, as Meghan said, one of the main issues that comes up is FEMA. If we were fortunate enough to have an individual assistance declaration where FEMA grants are available in a community in the wake of a disaster, that doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, everyone's going to go in and get FEMA support. And this is very surprising to people. For some reason, we all still think it should be like this, quite frankly, that, you know, FEMA support is there literally designed specifically to help address the needs of survivors from a financial standpoint in recovery, right? So you think that it would be easier to get access to that support. But in reality, about 15 years ago, Congress passed a law that basically required that any federal agency try not to waste money. And it sounded like a really good idea at the time because there was a lot of waste. You know, there just wasn't significant oversight because so many of these programs are so big that it's nearly impossible to make sure that every dollar is spent exactly in the way that you think it's supposed to be spent or that the agency intends that it be spent, right? But this ended up having some negative implications on certain agencies like FEMA, where FEMA has these sort of set of rules where you apply, you register, and then they reject a lot of people for sort of baseless reasons. And when I say baseless, it's not that they're not valid reasons, it's that they don't really apply in the given situation. So like in California, on average, after a disaster, over 85% of people are underinsured to some degree. And many of those are severely underinsured, which means if you're fortunate enough to even have insurance to begin with, right, there's a giant gap in the coverage that you have available versus the actual costs of repairing or replacing your loss, right, both your personal property and your dwelling. So at the same time, if you register for FEMA and you're answering their questions, they say, do you have insurance? And you say yes, they automatically will send you a letter that says you are not eligible. And they use the term not eligible. So people believe that they are not eligible, as in what we all think eligibility means. I don't just suddenly wake up one day and become eligible, right? This isn't an explanation of I was denied because you have insurance, but if you want to appeal, let us know if you have a gap and provide supporting documentation. So you end up with all of these people who have registered for FEMA that have insurance but are severely underinsured, will not be able to recover without FEMA support, yet they don't really understand that they can work their way through the system. And this is particularly problematic in certain insurance settings, such as mobile and manufactured homes, where mobile and manufactured home policies are simply not designed to address the needs of an individual in a total loss. So if you have a traditional homeowner's policy and you have a traditional stick-built house, you, for loss of use, which we also call additional living expense coverage, right, which is coverage that's designed to cover the cost of temporary housing while you're rebuilding and or replacing your lost home, right? A traditional policy may have no limit on loss of use, meaning it's just the value that you incur for a specified period of time. And if it does have a specific value attached to it, it's generally pretty big. It's generally somewhere between 20 and 50% of your dwelling coverage. So that would generally be at least $100,000, $200,000, oftentimes more than that. So it seems that that would be adequate to be able to house someone temporarily while they're rebuilding. If you then look at a mobile and manufactured home policy, that is really not the case at all. So oftentimes people with mobile and manufactured home policies, they'll have $2,000, $4,000, $6,000, $8,000 worth of additional living expense coverage. If you're really lucky, you might have 50 grand of additional living expense coverage in a policy like that. But when you live in a place like California, which is true of many states because of our housing crisis, that is not an adequate amount of money to allow you to survive and recover for the 36-month period that our state law allows for access to loss of use coverage. So those kinds of disparities they seem obvious, but they aren't considered in obtaining basically recovery support, like when you apply for FEMA. So the person with a traditional house that has, the 150 grand for additional living expense coverage, and the person with a manufacturer mobile home that has maybe 5 grand, they're both going to get the same response from FEMA. FEMA is going to tell both of them that because they're insured, they're not eligible for FEMA support. And if those individuals have a gap, they need to be put in a situation where they can have access to the information and the education necessary so that they know that they can actually get legal assistance to appeal this decision. And that's something that most people don't know, because most people don't deal with FEMA multiple times throughout their lives, let alone deal with homeowners insurance, right? And or renters insurance. Most people that have had a total loss, they maybe have filed a claim with a homeowners or renters policy, but it would be for like a garage theft or a leak in your kitchen, that kind of thing. Never something even remotely is difficult and complicated as administering an entire total loss claim. So you really start from a position where the community of survivors does not understand the process, and it's sort of up to us to help educate them and present that information to the community. And one of the things that we found on top of that is that it's also really difficult to help the community understand that most of the issues that they're going to run into related to recovery are going to be financial, emotional, or legal. And those are really the 3 main areas. And that is a bit challenging, because the immediate needs of that financial, I need a security deposit because I was a renter and I lost my home and I don't have an extra first, last, and security, right? Those financial needs, those immediate needs take precedent, especially in the early months of recovery. So really going out there into the community and helping them understand how to utilize the system and what their rights are, and in response to it is a challenge. And it ends up sort of creating, not creating, but aggravating those pre-existing disparities. And as a result, some of the legal impacts that we've highlighted and discussed, a number of them, like FEMA and insurance, but you also see it run into other things like employment, especially in situations where an individual's employment is, their housing is connected to their employment, where there's really not a lot of protections in that kind of setting. Price gouging. Post-disaster, you see a lot of people charging much more than what they should for things that they theoretically are prohibited from increasing the cost of more than a certain percentage. In California, it caps out at 10%. After a disaster, you can't increase the cost of goods, services, including housing, things like that, more than 10%. And almost all states have price gouging statutes. So this is something that's relevant, throughout the country. Yet people take advantage of it. And we have a hard time sort of addressing that. There are laws against it, but how do you actually, use those laws to force people to do the right thing? That's why, watch groups like Consumer Action become so important, to sort of present that information and education to individuals so they can advocate for themselves, and also let people know they're bad actors, that people are keeping an eye on this stuff, right? That's the same in construction, where there are people that definitely come in with the best of intentions, and that's great, but there are also what we call disaster contractors, where they move from disaster to disaster and essentially, in my opinion, take advantage of certain situations, because there's a lot of money to be made in a disaster. There is just a huge economy surrounding disasters, that it brings in the good just as much as it brings in the bad. And there are all these things that sort of come up that, you know, if you're not that kind of person that would take advantage of it, you're almost surprised, even though you know you shouldn't be, you know. But those are the kinds of things that we see through price gouging, construction, and other contractual relationships. So it's important to sort of keep your eyes on that kind of thing and your pulse on the community. So what can we do about this? Well, we can do what we're trying to do, right? One of the things Meghan addressed was VOADs and COADs, voluntary organizations active in disaster, and our community organizations active in disasters. That is an important thing. If you aren't a member of your COAD, which is generally a local jurisdiction like a county thing, and a VOAD, which is often a state and a regional thing, it's important to know who they are. You know, can you get involved? It doesn't require or demand a lot from you, but it does keep you very informed in terms of what is the plan? Who is going to step up to the plate when, you know, things go wrong and a disaster occurs? And until your community has a disaster, these often are not questions that have been answered prior to. So it's difficult to really prepare without your pulse, literally having these constant conversations with your community, both locally and on a state level. And hopefully, you know, in time, we'll be better prepared to help each other from a federal standpoint. Outside of that, you know, one thing that I've really learned throughout this is to be creative. And part of that is to know what the systems are that are in place that are supposed to address issues, right? So if you have, you know, a housing dispute and you happen to have fair housing in your community, well, use fair housing. You know, it doesn't have to just be, well, okay, let's file a lawsuit or threaten to file a lawsuit. Like, that generally is not the best way to go, especially for people that have already undergone significant trauma. Like, if you can find a, you know, way through to negotiations and or settlement by utilizing the system, it's generally much more helpful. This is also true even with really large sort of corporate entities like insurance, utilizing your state's Department of Insurance. They essentially will all have a complaints process where you can file a complaint, any individual can file a complaint, and that the department will attempt to mediate it or moderate it. Similarly, your state legislature, any congressperson, representative on a state level, they have an obligation to investigate basically the wrongdoings of any agency. So if you're not getting the support that you need from the Department of Insurance, then you contact your state legislature, and that state legislature has an obligation to reach out to the DOI and say, why is this person not getting the help or assistance that they need? It doesn't necessarily always turn out just easily and wonderful, but utilizing these processes keeps the cost down to the individual, which is huge because most people, especially when you're underinsured, have a very difficult time having access to legal support of any kind, right? Because they literally are behind when they start, so they need every penny they have, you know. And then you see the challenges of people spending their temporary housing funds and their personal property funds and or their dwelling funds on temporary housing because their gap is too big. So if you don't have enough money to rebuild or repurchase something immediately, then you end up in a situation where you're sort of getting further away from that goal, right? If your gap on day one starts out at 250 grand, it's not like you're going to come up with that 250 grand, you know, in a day or two. So the further down the road you get, the less sort of buying power, purchasing power your money has, which is particularly true from the disparity standpoint that we were talking about before. And policy changes, advocating for policy changes, being very involved, not just on a local level where, you know, any local jurisdiction has a right to pass emergency legislation, basically emergency ordinances, just like a state would have a right to pass emergency laws and or the federal government would. Well, look at it from who can help in this situation. Where are the holes? How can we fill them? Are there, you know, policy conversations that need to be had? You know, and I found that it's been very easy actually to work with our local and state government on these issues, and we've been able to really change a significant amount of laws in this state that have protected individual survivors in subsequent disasters, which is amazing, right? We still have ways to go, but it's important that that is, you know, is a way that it's looked at. So we're not just working within a system that's broken, because the real reality, which this slide addresses, why does disaster recovery fall short, is that until you're in a situation where you are responding to a disaster and there's a cohesive response, there generally is sort of a disconnect from one disaster to another, and from the way that each local jurisdiction will deal. So the local jurisdiction is involved in disaster recovery, obviously, as is the state jurisdiction, and hopefully the federal government too. So you have these three different entities trying to sort of frame disaster response that maybe have not worked together in a disaster before. So they don't have the, pre-existing relationships to really adequately address these needs, let alone a pre-existing understanding of the impact of a disaster from a practical standpoint, right? So that presents a significant challenge in terms of getting a uniform response that is also effective. So what can we do about this? Well, we can do a lot of things about it. The slide on Meghan's first or second slide showing sort of the cycle of what it means to sort of respond to a disaster. And one thing that I think every community that deals with disasters says in hindsight is, we should have been better prepared. And I can't tell you how true that is. If there is a way to prepare yourself in your community to learn what other communities have faced in terms of disaster response, and come together to sort of know who's going to be responsible for what, who's going to be doing what, and where your holes are, that kind of thing is invaluable. I mean, for example, we had a lot of fires in Oregon and Washington this year, which are nearby states to California, obviously. And I can't tell you how many calls I got from Oregon and Washington. People were just like, I randomly found your name, or somebody directed me to you. I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm like, look, nobody knows what they're doing until they're in this situation. They really don't. So to share that knowledge is great. But if you can glean that knowledge ahead of time, you're going to be in a way better position to really be able to comfortably and confidently address the needs of the community. And that's one of the things that we see frequently in disasters, is that you'll see certain types of personalities being willing to step up, because it is a learning curve. When I started this, it's not like I studied disaster law for 20 years prior to, right? These are things that you sort of have to learn as you go along, and create that community so you can reach out to those other individuals and get answers to the questions that you have, and work through that sort of support group, whether it be a COAD, a BOAD, or a collaborative of some kind. We have a number of collaboratives in California. I know a lot of other states do as well. We also have national collaboratives, so sort of familiarizing yourself with some of this stuff is a great way to begin to prepare. And then I think secondarily to the preparation model is, sharing the lessons that you've learned, and also putting people in a position where they have the information that they need to advocate for themselves. Because one thing that we see consistently with survivors is that they think, like we all do, right? Where if my insurance company tells me something, they're the insurance professional, so that thing must be true. Well, unfortunately, that is not often the case. There is often a huge lack of knowledge in the insurance setting in terms of the adjuster, the person from the insurance company adjusting the claim, because in a total loss setting, insurance companies basically farm out total loss disaster adjustments. So you will get survivors assigned to claims adjusters in very random places throughout the country that do not have a significant amount of familiarity with the laws of the state in which the disaster occurred. And they're telling, the survivor, well, they don't have a right to this, or they have to do that. And that might not be true at all, but the survivor doesn't know any better, because they haven't had access to the education that they need to really understand what their rights are. So creating that initial sort of response materials in terms of, you know, knowing what your rights are, helping individuals understand what those rights are, whether it be in insurance or housing or employment, construction. These are FEMA. These are all major issues that come up, and if you can have that stuff sort of ready beforehand, it can be super helpful. And I put my email in the chat. I have tons of materials and whatnot that I'm happy to share if you know, anyone is interested in seeing some examples of FAQs or slideshows or whatnot. So please feel free to reach out. What have we learned? I mean, one thing that I will say is that there is a big difference between what people think occurs post-disaster in terms of recovery versus the practical implications of what actually happens on the ground. And it is so important to track those practical implications to really have the ability to push forward the policy changes that need to occur to better address these issues the next time around. And that, I just can't express how invaluable that information and experience is. And it's things that are little, like Meghan was talking about FEMA and the 60-day deadline that you have to appeal. You have to register within 60 days, and then you have to appeal within 60 days after receiving a rejection. Well, they say 60 days, so we all assumed at the beginning that this was, you know, a harsh 60 days, right? We tried to get a more direct answer from FEMA, had many conversations with all kinds of FEMA reps and people high up to, you know, get a clear answer. And the truth was, nobody would answer it. They wouldn't tell us no. They would say, well, that is what we are told, basically. Yet, as Meghan learned, and she mentioned, and I learned myself as well, I'm just going to ignore that 60 days, right? I'm going to keep appealing. I mean, by ignore, by all means, if you can get it in before the 60 days, definitely get it in before the 60 days. But at the same time, you know, those kinds of practical implications are important, because if we all just thought, okay, well, it's 60 days, too bad, I would have had hundreds of clients that did not get access to the FEMA support they should have, because we just believed that deadline that FEMA said, when in reality, they actually do take appeals and applications, initial registrations after that 60-day period. So seeing what those lessons are, keeping track of what those lessons are so you can, you know, share that with others is so important. And also, as we were talking about on a related level, the policy implications that come from sharing this kind of information. And I won't go too much in depth here. You guys can read this part of the slide a little more closely if you want to, because it's based on California examples. But it is important to highlight that the need for policy change was apparent almost immediately post-disaster in California. And it was only further highlighted when we had, you know, a significantly horrific wildfire event the following year. And now they've just continued since then. A lot of these reforms circled around insurance, because that is the sort of one of the biggest buckets next to FEMA that you can push on really from a disaster platform, because it affects so many people. But we were able to change a lot of things that really have made a huge difference, especially in terms of how long they have access to their insurance benefits and what it means to have access. And what I mean by that is, right after the fires in 2017, we saw a lot of people having an experience where their insurance company would basically put random requirements on them. They would not be written down in a contract, so there was no, you know, obligation from a contractual standpoint in theory, but it was as if it was the way that the insurance company did business for years. So they just assumed that they could continue to do business this way, even though that isn't really how the law is supposed to work, right? And some of these things that we saw, led to the conclusion that way too many people are underinsured and have absolutely no idea that they're underinsured. You know, people went to their agents, they thought the agent was a professional in the industry. They knew what they were doing, and they trusted them. And then they go to find out that's really not the case, that they are significantly underinsured. And even worse, they often have a hard time getting access to the insurance coverage that they do have, because insurance companies basically are, because they're part of a capitalistic endeavor, at the end of the day, they are, there are forces at work there that are sort of competing with the interests of a total loss survivor from a disaster setting, right? The survivor needs every single penny they can get from their insurance policy, if they're fortunate enough to have one. And the insurance company wants to try and keep what they can, or minimally not pay what they don't feel they don't have to. So this sort of competing interest created, significant problems. And the other major issue that came on a state level was the duration of access, where in a standard insurance policy, a policy, and this is true in most states, a policy will tell you that you have 12 months for loss of use. Well, there are laws in many states, California being one of them, and also sometimes just based on different insurance companies have policies that provide this anyway, where if it's a federally declared disaster or a state declared disaster, the time frame for which you can obtain access to your coverage is extended. And in California in 2017, it went from 12 months that you standardly have access to coverage to 24 months. And people thought that that was great when that law was passed. The problem was that really is not enough time for individuals to rebuild, especially when you have this many losses. Literally from a logistical standpoint, because there just are not enough builders available to build everyone's home. But then secondarily, because of the other things that come first, right? Like our debris removal. It was one of the largest debris removal operations in United States history. And I know that that sounds kind of insane, because you think that there are, much broader areas that have been impacted by hurricanes and the like, but in a total loss setting, literally everything has to be removed. Not just the loss of the structures and the vehicles and everything that's left, but the asphalt, the trees, inches and inches of soil that is contaminated with carcinogens, etc. That process alone took 11 months. So people literally could not start to even contemplate rebuilding, let alone get a permit or something like that, until the debris removal process was over. So no one really had this benefit of the 24 months. So that then left people where, okay, well, if you're going to rebuild according to the law, you would have to get on it by day one, and everyone would kind of have to start at the same time, which obviously is not literally feasible, but also problematic, because for those who are underinsured, they, with the increasing cost of labor and materials, they were not able to rebuild immediately. They are in situations where they kind of have to hold off and wait until things settle down, that competition tamps off a little bit, so they can make smarter financial decisions about what it means to rebuild. So since that time, learning that the practical implications of that lesson, the time frame for access to coverage, both temporary housing, meaning loss of use, and also your replacement and extended replacement cost coverage, has extended to a minimum of 36 months, which in my mind is still not long enough, but it's a big difference between 24, and the hope is that some will interpret that law as being a minimum and not a maximum. And another thing that comes up in California, I know that comes up in other places, is the practical implications of non-renewals and or cancellations. So one of the major issues in California right now, which other states face too in a sort of different context, is insurance companies not wanting to basically continue to provide coverage in certain areas because the risk from their perspective is too high. So this is a political issue, but there needed to be a Band-Aid on it. It's something that we're focusing on in the legislature this year here, but the Band-Aid is basically to prohibit cancellations of policies for 12 months post a wildfire event and or declare disaster, and then to require renewals for 2 renewal periods. Neither one of these are ideal. I think they also give people a bit of a false sense of security because, sure, you have to renew your policy for 2 years, but if the individual then rebuilds and thinks that they're going to keep being able to renew their policy, and that may not be the case, that's obviously problematic. So as you see, we learned some lessons, hence the Band-Aid, but we continue to learn lessons, which is why, Legal Aid has advocated this year for a number of things, but one of them being to modify this law so it can actually be more effective in addressing the reality that we need people to have insurance, right? And then additionally, on a federal level, Meghan talked about this some, so I won't go too far into it, but the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act, which basically reformed FEMA's disaster assistance program, that is also an important federal reform. We push for that. I know that a number of organizations throughout the country push for FEMA reforms, largely because from a practical standpoint, there were significant concerns about transparency and basically people being treated differently. So, 2 people send in the same request. One FEMA employee approves the request for assistance. Another FEMA employee says, no, you can't have it. You need to do A, B, C, D, and E. And there's no reason that those 2 responses should have been different at all. So the DRA attempts to sort of address some of these holes, attempts to provide more transparency. I will say that part of the problem whenever you pass a federal reform in a setting like this is oversight. It's sort of like, here, FEMA, here's this law, go and read it. It's about you. You're supposed to implement these changes, but who's overseeing it? Well, in theory, it's Congress, but in reality, from a practical standpoint, it's FEMA that's kind of overseeing, the implementation of some of these laws. So if you're in a situation where you have to deal with FEMA and there are pieces from the DRA that make sense to use, I would definitely recommend, putting that language back on FEMA, where, for example, one thing that's important in the DRA is that individuals with disabilities can get financial assistance or grants for disability-related needs that do not take away from the maximum benefit available either in the Individuals Assistance IHP program or the Individual Assistance Other Needs Assistance program, which means that there's literally additional funds for people in that situation. And we've found that a lot of FEMA employees are not aware of that fact. So going and finding that language and the statute and sending it to your FEMA employee is a very good way to get them to say, oh, okay, I get it. Additionally, also there's the ability to arbitrate disputes, where previously this wasn't true. You were sort of limited to filing appeals, and potentially every once in a while people try and file lawsuits. It's really hard to sue the government, so I wouldn't recommend it, but those were sort of the only ways that you could, try and get to the other side of it. Well, now with the DRA, you're allowed to demand arbitration, which means that you get to, go sit down as an individual survivor and or if you're an attorney or representative with your client in front of a FEMA representative and an arbitrator to say, hey, this is why I believe this survivor is entitled to these FEMA benefits, and we don't know why they're not getting them. And then that arbitrator makes a decision that's binding. So we haven't had enough experience trying to utilize that system yet because it's obviously relatively new with the passing of the DRA, but it will be interesting to see how that stuff goes and sort of what the need overall for it is. So next piece of the puzzle is insurance. We talked about this a bit. I'll just go through some sort of, since it's such a big issue that comes up, some overview of things that many of you probably already know. So I won't go too in depth, but to try and highlight some of the things that, common pitfalls or things people might not know. So standardly, we have, questions of what does a homeowner's policy cover, what does a renter's policy cover, and what does an auto policy cover? Generally, a homeowner's insurance policy covers an insured's dwelling, an insured, which is, the actual physical improvement upon the land in which you use as your residence, right? Their personal property, which includes common personal property that we would all use. If there's a specialty property, a business property, something like that, it's not going to be covered unless you have an additional rider on your policy for it. And then temporary living expenses. The reason that I wanted to share this information is because that may seem obvious, but one of the things that isn't obvious is what does that really mean? And in rural or semi-rural areas, which is not just limited to that, but this is sort of a bigger way of looking at it. There are a lot of things that traditional homeowners policies don't cover, and people were really unaware of this. So, for example, if you live in a rural or semi-rural area, you may be responsible for your driveway, right? You may have a bridge, you may have a well or a joint well, you may have a septic system, you may have a pump house, you may have, a horseshoe pit in your backyard, right? Who knows? Now I'm just making stuff up. You may have, a ton of trees on your property. Well, none of those things are covered in a traditional homeowner's policy. So if you're in a position as a survivor where you have a rural or semi-rural property, and sure, the home is covered, but your septic, your well, your pump house, your trees, like even the debris removal of the tree, not even just the replacement of the tree, if that's not covered, you're talking about an additional couple $100,000. So it's a huge gap that people start off with. And that's also assuming that the structure itself was adequately insured. So really understanding what is covered and what isn't covered and what kind of policy an individual needs is really, really important. I can't stress that enough. And from a renter's policy standpoint, it's sort of similar, and also kind of rolled into this is also we see condo policies too, where a renter's policy and generally condo policies are the same way. They're designed to sort of cover what's inside of the house. It's not deemed a fixture. So really your personal property and things that are movable or removable easily, if that makes sense. There are also generally some loss of use coverage or additional living expense coverage in renters policies. But I will say as a caveat to that, number one, they may be low. So understanding what your needs are as a renter for a renter's policy is important. Quite frankly, the difference between being adequately insured and underinsured is almost absolutely nothing. It could be as little as $20 a year. So there's no reason to cut corners in this area at all. Yet we find that is the kind of thing that often happens. And also from a renter's standpoint, it's important to know how your insurance company understands what it means to use your additional living expense coverage. So some renters insurance policies will allow you to use your additional living expense coverage as in, I was a renter over here, I lost my rental unit, now they're gonna pay to put me up somewhere else, right? Other insurance companies look at it as, you were a renter that suffered a total loss. At that total loss rental, you paid $1,000 a month for rent. Now you're paying $2,000 a month for rent. So we'll pay you the difference. We'll pay you $1,000 a month to make up the difference between the $1,000 and $2,000 that you're now paying. The reason that that's important is because renters are often underinsured, just because that's the way renters policies are generally written. They're not really designed to make people whole, especially not from a total loss setting. So they're often in a situation where they're financially behind the ball to begin with, and any penny that they can get access to becomes that much more important. So if you know you have a policy where it's just making up the difference in rent and you're fine with that, fine. But if you aren't, then that's the kind of thing to understand and explore, because insurance companies can treat that kind of stuff differently. And another important thing on this subject is auto insurance. So state law mandates certain levels of coverage, right? People generally don't understand that either A, minimum coverage doesn't cover a lot of things, right? Including if you hit somebody else, right? But they definitely don't understand that in a disaster setting, because they think, well, I didn't have anything to do with it. I wasn't a bad actor in the situation, so why wouldn't my insurance cover it? And that may seem like, you know, if you're someone that understands comprehensive coverage, it may seem like, okay, well, yeah, everyone knows that if you don't have comprehensive, you're not going to have this coverage. A lot of people did not understand that, especially in the disaster loss setting. So sharing that information and, you know, educating people on how to adequately insure themselves, both from a homeowner's insurance policy, renter's policy, and auto policy, is really important. And then just the simple logistics. How do you file an insurance claim? Well, it's pretty simplistic. You basically call your insurance carrier. One thing that's interesting in a disaster setting is oftentimes people have never read their insurance contract. Sometimes they don't even remember who their insurance provider is. Like that, you know, they signed up when they got a mortgage or something. So they're like, I think it might be State Farm, you know, but they're really not sure. So that's something that is important to sort of help people figure out pretty early on. Filing a claim is easy. You can call your insurance carrier. Now you can do it online and or on, most insurance carriers also have apps where you can just file a claim. We recommend anytime you're doing any sort of claim related thing with an insurance company that you do it in writing. You know, don't just do it over the phone, that you keep notes so, you know, you can hold them to what they tell you moving forward. And then it's also really important to start the claims process soon. I bring this up, it may seem obvious, but people are really, really overwhelmed after a total loss, or even just a disaster, even if it isn't a total loss, right? So they have a difficult time sort of working through a lot of these steps. One, they can get help, you know, if they either from agencies like ours or, you know, from family members and friends and things like that. But those who don't, you end up seeing that they sort of put a lot of this stuff off. And one thing that you really cannot put off is the filing of that insurance claim, because you have an obligation to file a claim if you want coverage, and you have an obligation to cooperate with the claims process if you want coverage. And that's true independent of really what you feel your personal bandwidth is at the time. So, you know, you can make those arguments to your insurance company, I need more time for this and that, but it is one of those things that you do not want to get behind the ball on, because if you have insurance, it's going to be a very important piece of the puzzle for recovery. And once you file your insurance claim, basically the insurance company, which actually kind of works a little bit like FEMA, your insurance company will send out an adjuster. Those adjusters, when you're in a large loss setting, are generally going to be third-party contractors that are sent out to take a look at your loss site. So they basically go there to verify, if needed, home ownership and or rentership, right? But primarily the loss and what the loss entails. So if it's completely demolished, then they'll verify the address and the APN number. If the structure is still there but damaged, they'll take pictures and basically, you know, go through checklists of what they think their valuation is. Once they have the original site visit, they then do what's called a scope of loss. And a scope of loss, basically, well, the way most insurance companies do it is they use a software program to put in certain specifications about a home or about the damage to a home, and then it spits out a estimated value. Never, never, never just trust that estimated value. I find it is rarely, rarely, rarely accurate, keeping in mind that most of the time people come to me because they have complaints. However, you know, we just don't consistently see that software to be accurate. And I think it's very, very important for people to know that, because the first time they get a scope of loss, they're thinking, okay, it falls within my coverage, I'm going to be great, I'll be able to rebuild or repair. And then they go talk to a contractor, and their contractor's like, nope, not even close, not even 50% of what it would cost to do this. Wouldn't even cover materials, you know. So you definitely have to allow the insurance company to do their own adjustment and inspection. However, definitely get an estimate from a builder, more than one if that's possible. You can also enlist private companies or individuals to do scopes of loss and or go through the scope of loss that your insurance company did to point out where the flaws are. But do not just rely on that scope of loss, because it is often very, very inaccurate, and it sends up a false sense of security for the survivor after they've already been through enough. So it's challenging. Also, it's important just to note all states have different rules on the subject. This kind of information should be available generally on your state's Department of Insurance website. But there will be time periods and sort of requirements by which your insurance company has to abide in terms of responding to you, accepting or denying your claim, agreeing to pay on your claim, and things of that nature. If your claim has been denied for some reason, I definitely recommend, short of litigation, reaching out to your insurance company, asking them why, asking them for a copy of your file, asking them for, any documentation related to the rejection, file a request for assistance or a complaint with your state's Department of Insurance. Don't be afraid to be creative if you can. We've gone to the press to share stories where they've been incredibly unfair to members of our community. That stuff works, have that conversation and don't be afraid to keep pushing that issue. The common issues that we see individuals have, as we sort of talked about this on a FEMA level, it's true of a lot of these processes in general, is that there is a general lack of knowledge regarding insurance law. Unfortunately, that's not only true of the survivor, it's often true of the adjuster, as we said before. So really gaining that education, understanding what the important pieces of the puzzle are, educating individuals so that they feel confident enough in the knowledge that they have to go to their insurance company and say, no, Mr. Adjuster, I know what my rights are. This is my right in this situation. And similarly to that, one thing that we always say is if your insurance company is asking you to do something and you don't know why, ask them where it says that in your contract. And if they can't point out in your insurance contract that it tells you you have to do that, then they can't just suddenly require that you do it. One thing I often tell to clients is that at the end of the day, you really don't need to be an attorney to do this stuff. And then I always joke that other attorneys would probably disagree with me. However, I do believe that, in large part, I think at the end of the day, civil law is primarily about the agreement to sort of be in a social contract where we all agree we're going to treat each other reasonably. It's why if we were walking down the street and we saw one person slap another, we would all be outraged because that's just not reasonable behavior. It's not appropriate, period, end of story. Well, that kind of theory applies in any civil setting, and it's very true in the insurance setting. So I tell people, if something feels unreasonable, if it feels wrong, trust that gut instinct. It probably is. And if it is, it very well might not be legal, So when an insurance company is trying to tell you, no, you don't have that right, no, you're not entitled to that, or you have to do all these things or jump through all these hoops, and it just isn't sitting right, trust that and see where you can go with it, because there are laws to protect people, and there are, watchdog agencies and the like. They can also help protect people. So keeping that piece in the back of your mind is important. And then the other two issues, as we've said, are being underinsured and addressing issues of bad faith. So negotiating with your insurance company, we've kind of talked about this, so I won't go too far in depth into it, but I will say or add that a lot of people think that they have to sort of take this kind of first offer. Well, that's really not how insurance works, especially in a total loss setting, where you're really going to go back and forth. I still have clients that lost houses in 2017 that haven't even started the rebuilding process because they're still adjusting their claim with their insurance company. And I have many of them, many. So the trajectory of insurance, the insurance process is long. It is not something that just gets tidied up in a little bow really quickly. Sometimes it can. Sometimes people luck out and they get really great adjusters. But, unfortunately, that's not the most common scenario. So really understanding your rights and obligations, knowing that, is the insured, you don't have an obligation to just, take what the insurance company tells you is the value of your home. You don't have to work with the contractor your insurance company tells you have to work with. You can choose one of your own. There are many pieces about the process that need to be learned, and that's just going to take time. So don't let them pressure you into, just settling the claim. And then the final piece of the puzzle that often comes up is the question of bad faith. So underinsurance and bad faith are really two major issues that we see Not a lot of states have laws about underinsurance, meaning there's not really a lot of protection on a state level for against underinsuring individuals, but there are generally a lot of protections on a state level against insurance companies engaging in bad faith. They vary from state to state. Generally, your Department of Insurance is the one that's responsible for overseeing and regulating the insurance industry, so they set the tone of what bad faith means. They'll generally have regulations that say, insurance industry, you cannot do this in our state because we think that this constitutes bad faith. Familiarizing yourself with that. Some of them seem simple enough, but they happen very frequently. Like, intentionally lowballing people, not paying on a claim that is obviously due, not communicating in an effective manner, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the list goes on, but it's important to sort of understand what that is, to know when you see bad behavior. Because if there is bad behavior, then obviously there can also arise liability. And similarly, the issue of misrepresentation, whether that happens when you're purchasing the policy or if it happens when you are basically going through the claims process. Your insurance company is theoretically prohibited from misrepresenting to you your coverage, the value of your coverage, your policy, obligations under your policy, etc. So even though that's true, we often see insurance companies interpreting their policies in ways that do not make sense. Like one thing that we saw significantly in California with Safeco was that Safeco tells people that if they repurchase a home on a new parcel of land rather than rebuilding on the lost parcel, that they are going to deduct the value of the land. That is not lawful. The contract says absolutely nothing about it, yet there's a line in the contract that says we do not cover land. That's true in all insurance contracts, well, homeowners insurance contracts. And they point to that one line to say, oh, well, that means that we get to deduct land value if you repurchase. There is no support of this, but Safeco has sort of implemented this as a company-wide policy. So literally thousands and thousands of people are impacted by this decision, yet it is a complete misrepresentation of the terms of the policy. So those kinds of things you'll see systemically. I mean, we could talk about the bad actors and the systemic problems, unfortunately, for a very long time, but sort of knowing what those common pitfalls are can be a good way to, sort of work through the process and make sure that you get, the most you can out of your policy, or if you're helping someone else, the most they can out of their policy. And then some of this other stuff is, if your company is refusing to settle, they're not doing the right thing, that kind of thing. They're not supposed to do that. And then equally as important is sort of the question of, when do I hire an attorney? Should I hire an attorney? When do I hire a private adjuster? Should I hire a private adjuster? I think in the total loss setting or in the disaster setting that it is not ideal for someone to engage in litigation. They've been through trauma already. Litigation is not for the faint of heart. It takes a significant amount of time, effort, and energy. So if there is any way not to do that, I would definitely recommend that. With that said, sometimes people are not left with a lot of choice. For example, I have a case in litigation right now with 10 incredibly vulnerable plaintiffs. We've been arguing with the insurance company for 3 years to pay benefits that are very, very clearly due under the law. And they just simplistically refused to pay, which left us no choice but to file litigation. However, those are 10 people and are hundreds of people that I've helped and have not had to file litigation. So being deliberate about that, using the process that's available, whether it's, negotiating directly with your insurance company, filing a complaint with the Department of Insurance, going to your state legislature and enlisting their help, those kinds of things can work. They work time and time again. So if you can try those prior to, I definitely recommend it. And then very quickly, the issues that we see come up in rebuilding are vast. However, just to highlight a few of them, one major problem that we see because so many people are underinsured is that, well, let me back up. prior to the disaster setting, public policy sort of viewed the construction industry in terms of a full, complete home contract, right? They viewed that a person who is wealthy enough to build a home from the ground up was obviously wealthy enough to hire an attorney. So there generally are not a lot of laws in a state, in any state, to protect new home construction. And that is very contrary to the disaster setting, where a huge majority of people are underinsured for starters. Secondarily, those who find themselves severely underinsured end up using their personal property as well as their dwelling coverage to rebuild their home. So they literally don't have any money left over to do anything else, and they're cutting corners. So they end up trying to find, you know, the least expensive contractor and spending every penny that they have to, you know, get to that number where they can at least rebuild something. So they're not in a position where if their contractor screws them over, they can just go and hire an attorney, because that kind of case law is really governed by the contract between the insured and the homeowner. And as a result, you end up in a situation where you're paying out of pocket as the homeowner to foot the bill for the attorney in the suit. And that can cost a ton of money. And in this situation, money people don't have. So to really know who your contractor is, don't make those rush decisions. You know, definitely check that your contractor is licensed. It seems like a simple thing, but I can't tell you how many times that doesn't happen. And the other piece of the puzzle that is huge is financial stability. You want to know that whatever builder you're working with has enough money not only to foot your build and the cost of it, but to foot all builds that he's doing or she's doing at that time. Because if they can't, they are likely to end up in financial trouble that may cause the company to fold. And this is something that we see commonly after disasters, where contractors come in and they sort of bite off more than they can chew, and then they're, you know, trying to rob Peter to pay Paul. They're, you know, trying to get another person to sign up to build a house with them so they can get some money from them to cover, you know, the crew that's on the house right before them. And it does not go well. And I will say we have seen this happen to many building companies. So it is very important to make a very deliberate decision, both from a reputational standpoint, but also from a financial stability standpoint, about what contractor you're working with. And then finally, just some helpful resources. As we said, definitely check out your Department of Insurance website for your state. They're going to have consumer materials and access. Definitely check out Disaster Legal Aid's website. I know Jeanne will be talking about that with Pro Bono Net. And then also a lot of states, not all of them, but a lot of states have a platform called Free Legal Answers that's run by basically the state bar. And it's basically a website. Sometimes it's also a hotline where an individual can call and or, you know, go online and post a legal question, and they will get an answer from an actual attorney. So those kinds of things can be very important for individuals sort of trying to work through the process, especially because one of the things we found is that there really are not many attorneys who are available to help individuals sift through or muddle through a lot of this, largely because there's not a lot of money in it. That's just sad to say, but it's true. So you end up with a lot of people that really need that kind of help and support. Well, thank you for your time. I put my email in the chat again if you want to reach out with questions, and thank you for having me.
Now we will hear from Ms. Jeanne Ortiz. Take it away, Ms. Ortiz.
Thank you, Linda. First of all, thank you to everyone at Consumer Action for organizing this webinar and for the opportunity to join you today. I'm Jeanne Ortiz. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Pro Bono and Strategic Initiatives Manager at Pro Bono Net, and I am based out of New York. And before I share some disaster preparedness and recovery resources and tips, I just want to share a little bit more about what we do at Pro Bono Net and our connection to disaster response and recovery. So Pro Bono Net is a national nonprofit dedicated to increasing access to justice through technology, and we do that by creating and hosting self-help legal information and tools online across states, supporting attorneys and other advocates through resource sharing, communications and networking, and collaborating and working with civil legal aid organizations to increase their impact through technology and advocacy strategies. And one of our collaborative projects is the National Disaster Legal Aid Resource Center, commonly referred to as disasterlegalaid.org, which I'll show you in a few minutes. That includes resources not only on how to recover, but also on how to prepare. And I'll just walk you through some of the resources in a few minutes that are helpful for disaster survivors and the advocates helping them. And I think Meghan and Kendall did a great job speaking to the great impact that natural disasters can have on communities, right? And how much is needed for a recovery that is fair and just for individuals and families. And there are numerous studies and reports when it comes to people in the United States being prepared for natural disasters or emergencies. And over the years, I think there has been one recurring theme, and that is that the majority of people do not prepare or have enough preparedness plans in place in the event of an emergency. And I wanted to share that one report this year from the National Domestic Preparedness Survey. It was actually, that was the title of the survey, which then became a report. They also analyzed the group behind the survey, they analyzed COVID's impact in the context of emergency preparedness. And they found that 60% of Americans thought that a major disaster was likely to impact them or their family over the next 5 years, but 50% did not have an emergency plan in place. I was in Puerto Rico when Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit, and one of the things that I heard the most was, I never thought that this would happen to me, or, you know, I lost everything in my home, or things like I didn't know that I would need these type of documents, that I would need to prepare or collect these types of document in advance to get help from the Federal Emergency Management Agency or another government agency. And now it's going to take me longer to replace them. And then, you know, government agencies were hit by the disaster too, and many of them were closed or delaying services to replace documents. So what am I going to do now, or how long am I going to have to wait to get help? So I share this because in emergency response, we always talk about the importance of preparedness for recovery, right? And since more and more disasters are expected. So if you have a good preparedness plan, I think it'll make it easier for recovery once disaster strikes. And I included here some general tips on what to think about when preparing for a natural disaster. Ready.gov is a great resource to look at the types of documents that you should keep in a safe place in the event of a disaster. And there are checklists like the American Red Cross provides, and also checklists by legal service organizations or communities in your area, depending on where you are. And most of the documents that we talk about when preparing for a disaster include documents related to identity, such as a passport or a state-issued license to prove who you are, and also information related to where you live, like utility bills to prove payments, a lease or rental agreement to prove that you live there, and any insurance or medical information. And these are all important because, you know, if you need to evacuate or you have to leave your home, or if your house is flooded and you don't want to lose these documents if that happens. And also because as Meghan and Kendall pointed to, these are documents that you may need to get disaster recovery assistance from the government. And disasterlegalaid.org So this is a national resource where we host and develop self-help tools and information for people affected by natural disasters. And we also include here preparedness plans and checklists and resources that can help communities plan in the event of an emergency. And in general, most of the resources that we host here are for survivors who are looking for information about their legal rights after a disaster. We post information related to active disasters. So that means only when it's declared a major disaster and where there's an active legal help hotline in partnership with the American Bar Association Disaster Legal Services Program. So there has to be a legal help hotline that the Federal Emergency Management Agency requires the American Bar Association to set up because of an agreement that they have, the two organizations, or FEMA and the American Bar Association. And so I'll show more about what this looks like when I provide the tour, but it's basically information on active disaster areas and how survivors can locate legal help depending on where they're located. And this website started in 2005, immediately after Hurricane Katrina. And since then, we've partnered with organizations to help amplify their resources on the website, create new resources relevant to the delivery of legal aid to disaster survivors, and also to help connect advocates and attorneys engaged in this work. So we also encourage organizations who are responding to disasters to share their resources with us so that we can help amplify them, and also any guides or checklists or resources that we could share across regions that other areas responding to disasters might benefit from. And for advocates, we have the National Disaster Legal Aid Advocacy Center, which helps connect not only attorneys providing legal help to survivors, but also connect other advocates interested in learning more about what's going on in the disaster relief world. So I think there's a variety of advocacy, or there's a variety of advocates engaged in this work. And as we continue to see more and more disasters, I think that advocacy will become more and more important. And this resource is really to externalize that knowledge and support network by building a list of advocates engaged in this work and highlighting the groups in it, and amplifying the efforts that are being done to help communities recover. And we also provide a set of curated resources related to disaster relief, and we do this in partnership with Lone Star Legal Aid, where Meghan is also working at. We do this in partnership with them because of their experience with disaster relief and their subject matter expertise. And I'll show you some parts of this resource as well, but this year we also launched Figuring Out FEMA, which is a pocket-sized guide that breaks down the process of enrolling in FEMA's individual assistance program, how to appeal a decision from FEMA on financial or housing assistance, and also some general and basic rights that survivors have when interacting with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And Pro Bono Net created this resource in partnership with a design nonprofit based out of New York, and with the support from a group of attorneys from across the country who have experienced disasters and the impact that they've had in their communities. And they provided their feedback on how to develop a national resource, so a resource like this one that could be applicable or relevant on a national level for disaster survivors affected by these emergencies anywhere in the United States. So this is something that you could download for free or share in your community, or if it's something you would want to hand out in a community event or distribute with disaster preparedness or recovery kits or anything like that, they're available for purchase and print as well. And the design nonprofit, they're called the Center for Urban Pedagogy, will work with you to determine a cost depending on the number of copies you would like. But again, like I said, it's free for digital download. And we do have some hard copies available as well in our office. If anyone's interested, we're always happy to send you a set of samples. And finally, in 2014, Pro Bono Net partnered with the City Bar Justice Center in New York to create the FEMA Appeals Online Interview, which guides a FEMA applicant who wants to appeal a denial or an amount awarded through an appeal letter. And once they've completed the guided online interview, they can print send to their email or a third party like an attorney for review. And I'll do a quick demo on how this works in case you work directly with survivors, or this is something that you would also want to present or share at community events or within your organization. We always recommend people seek the help of an attorney first, or have them review the appeal before submitting a letter to FEMA. So that's a best practice. And we do that because this does not create an attorney-client relationship, and it's not legal advice or representation. So the tools does not interpret any information entered by the user, but rather guides a survivor or the person completing the interview section by section of a FEMA appeal to make the process easier to digest or to break down and organize the information in a way that's presentable to FEMA, and then they can review it. And with the interview, users are also able to complete a file request letter for FEMA. And then I'll show you this as well. The appeal includes information about the process and frequently asked questions about how to engage with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So this is really an alternative for people who, for a variety of reasons, do not reach a legal service provider or cannot access an organization in the area, or who cannot afford an attorney to help them with their recovery. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through some of the resources that we host, and I'm going to request presenter controls. Wonderful, thank you. So this is a disaster legal, the National Disaster Legal Aid Resource Center. Let me just zoom in a little bit. And we divide the content between resources for survivors, legal services attorneys, and attorneys who want to volunteer their time for disaster response efforts. And like I said, we also host disaster preparedness resources. This is a curated list on where survivors can start, what documents to gather in advance of an emergency, and we'll see that some of these resources become popular immediately after a disaster because often I think groups and communities think about what lessons did we learn from this disaster, and what can we do to make sure that we can recover quicker when the next disaster hits. So I think very good information, really good stuff as to how communities can prepare, and specifically for individuals or families impacted by disasters, documents and checklists that they can download or print or have on their phone, or make a list on a notebook on things that it's, as a best practice, it's good to keep, so that the recovery phase doesn't have too many obstacles. And we have some examples here about other resources like disaster kits that organizations have created for communities or organizations or families to use. And then some for small business owners, what they can do as well. And then a list of other resources that touch on the preparedness theme of natural disasters. And then, so if I go back here, we also have a section where it's directed to survivors. on the Do You Need Legal Help section. And this is where we host general information, so general and national information that applies to any survivor in the United States looking for legal help if they've been affected by a natural disaster. So that means information on FEMA or other government agencies that provide relief, the Small Business Administration, and then common issues that Kendall and Meghan already touched on, like replacing documents, housing, insurance, mortgage issues, and other issues that typically arise over the phases of recovery, whether that's short-term, medium-term, or long-term. And we also include a law help link, so depending on whether the survivor is located, they can click here and it'll lead them to a statewide resource managed by a legal service organization in whichever state the individual lives or the territory that they live. And they can also click here and just look up information that's unique to their area. And on the right side, what we do is, and this is what I was talking about earlier, we post information on active disasters. So this includes the hotline number, like you see here with Florida and Hurricane Sally, the hotline number that has been set up by the American Bar Association's Disaster Legal Services Program in partnership with local legal service organizations providing legal help to survivors affected by that disaster. So this is the hotline number that people can call if they believe that they could use the help of an attorney, or if they need anything else in terms of advice or legal representation related to an issue caused or exacerbated by the disaster. And I'm just going to click here so you can see an example on the type of information that we provide. This information is curated by Lone Star Legal Aid, and we receive information from the organizations leading the effort and providing legal help resources to survivors. So we make sure that that information, we can amplify it here. And as you can see, we make sure to include important deadlines so that people are aware that there are deadlines running against them when it comes to recovery, the most famous or the most important one being the FEMA application deadline, and then the term to appeal a FEMA decision on an amount awarded for help. General information about government disaster relief benefits, and then in this section we provide information about the legal assistance available in the individual's area. So, for example, Legal Services of North Florida is helping people recover from Hurricane Sally in Florida. And then we also include any other organization that the organizations tell us to include if people are looking for legal help. And then I'll walk you through the FEMA appeals interactive interview. So I'll just go here, and it's actually here. This is the page where it provides some instructions on how to appeal FEMA and where to send the appeal. We also have a frequently asked questions page that was reviewed by pro bono attorneys at a law firm immediately after the major disasters that happened during 2017 and 2018. So this covers some general information and some common questions that we were able to collect from different regions on what survivors, wanted to know about the FEMA appeals process, and some brief answers that can help direct a person and just try to understand the process a little bit better, because at least for me, my first time with the FEMA appeal, it was somewhat confusing, and it was something that it immediately after a disaster, it can be overwhelming to try to learn about what FEMA, like FEMA's process is, and how to appeal a determination if you've been denied a certain amount of money or awarded less money than you need to recover for the disaster. And this is some acceptable documentation. I think this table is really nice as to what FEMA will accept for an appeal, and what documentation is helpful to collect to make your case about why FEMA erred in their decision. And I'm just going to walk you through what it looks like. I'm not going to go through the whole interview. I'm almost done, but this is where the survivor could go to and begin an appeal. So I'm just going to complete some of the first sections. And like I said earlier, this is something that could help, you know, if a person can't access an attorney, or if they're running out of time, this just helps create an appeal that the survivor can download for themselves. And this was also reviewed by attorneys in New York after, you know, this was created after Sandy. So it covers all of the basics of a FEMA appeal. So I'm just going to do some test fields here. And as you can see, it requires information, the user to enter information that will be helpful for them to include in the appeal as the Federal Emergency Management Agency requires it. And so it asks questions, you know, reasons you believe the decision was wrong, and the survivor or anyone who's helping a survivor can enter here the reason and outline any facts or information that they think would be helpful to explain why they deserve a review from FEMA. And once you complete this interview, it'll prompt you to this page where it'll give you some options on what to do with the appeal that has been created. So you can download the appeal, you can edit your answers on a Word document, save the answers, or email the answers to a third-party email address like an attorney, for example, to review. And once you do that, this is what it looks like. So it provides instructions on how to file an appeal with FEMA, some common denial reasons codes, and then here you see whatever I entered in that page in the interview, it'll appear here with all of my information. I can edit it as needed, and then I would have to sign it, print it, and file with FEMA. And there's also a request for information from FEMA file, which is also helpful to request from FEMA, so that the survivor can understand better why FEMA denied their assistance application. And then finally, just an overview of FEMA. This is the resource that I was talking about earlier as well, and some tips on what to do. Let me just download here. This is where the resource that we created and launched this year. So like I said, it provides an overview of FEMA and some tips on what to do if you pay for repairs before you apply for assistance. It also covers, you know, what are your rights when interacting with FEMA, either in person or on the phone. There's some information on eligibility, on who can apply and how to apply, whether it's online, by phone, or at a disaster recovery center. And I know that that's different because of COVID-19 now, but these mechanisms are still available. How does it work? I think this, as I was saying earlier, this can also become tricky because there are so many moving parts, and there's some overlap with the Small Business Administration. There may be overlap with some insurance um, claims that the survivor may have, or some insurance protection that can become complicated if you file an application with FEMA. But we did our best to sort of capture this in this very small page as to what a survivor should expect when interacting with FEMA and requesting for financial or housing or other assistance to recover. And then some information on what happens after you apply with FEMA and how to appeal. One common issue that happens after disasters is around scams. So we also included a checklist that survivors can use when working with contractors and when interacting with someone who's inspecting their home, and general information about, you know, if the person thinks that they've been scammed, or that they're going through a fraudulent situation. And finally, this is just some information on what to include in your appeal, and what to expect after you appeal, and what FEMA is supposed to do after they receive that letter from the survivor. We included also some resources that you've already seen on disasterlegalaid.org, but of course we encourage people to make sure that they reach out for legal assistance in their area, so that attorneys can present their full range of options in terms of recovery. And this is the National Disaster Legal Advocacy Center, which I mentioned earlier, where we usually capture updates on what's going on with the field, you know, what efforts are happening on the ground in terms of disaster relief advocacy, and advocacy related to how people can help support communities impacted by disasters. So that can be everything from legal to what, you know, long-term recovery groups are doing on the ground, and how, what's helpful to share for advocates visiting this website, and staying up to date on that. And we also curate a list of events that both attorneys and advocates, other advocates engaged in this work, can visit and sort of peruse here, to try to keep in touch and stay updated on what's going on and disaster recovery. And this calendar, I think, is really full when disasters strike, because there's a lot of activity going on after a disaster, and a lot of efforts and advocacy happening around that. So that concludes my web tour, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and request the presentation again, where I've included my email. So if you go to the next slide, I've included my email here as well, in case you would want to, you know, reach out with any questions or comments. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Ortiz. Thank you for a great presentation. Let's go to questions now. It's time to hear from you. We want to hear from you, and I know you have tons of questions for us.
Yes, we do have some questions, and if folks have not typed in their questions, go ahead and do so now. Somebody's asking, does the IHP cover rental assistance due to coronavirus job loss?
No.
Anything in terms of
Unfortunately, no. There was no federal individual assistance declaration related to COVID. The federal response was a little disjointed. So basically, you have the CARES Act. Under the CARES Act, there is unemployment that is administered on a state level, but there's a federal subsidy basically provided. So the value of payment varies for unemployment per state, and the federal program provides an additional value of money for a certain period of time. People were supposed to have applied by, I believe, July 25th for the original inclusion of the initial funds, but you can still apply for unemployment related to COVID-related job loss especially, well, let me say this. You could always apply for unemployment if you lost a job and you're an employee who has, a W-2, right? The CARES Act also extended who qualifies as an employee under the meaning of unemployment. So that was expanded to include people who are self-employed or gig workers and the like. So I definitely recommend filing for unemployment if you've lost your job as a result of COVID.
Thank you. And also another question is, how do you see a homeowner's outcome affected by what happens with their mortgage servicer? What role does the servicer play in all of this?
That is a really good question. And, unfortunately, a lot of mortgage companies / almost every single one, they do not have total loss departments. So they are not really used to dealing with disasters until they're thrown into the mix. As a result of that, we generally see struggles with mortgage companies. First of all, from a legal standpoint, the mortgage company is a co-insured, so they have a right to insurance coverage in terms of the value of what their surety interest is. In California, we saw a lot of mortgage companies think that they had control over the whole policy, which, first of all, that's not true, but you have to educate your mortgage holder to let them know that that is not true. They can sort of maintain and control the flow of money up to the value that they have an interest in. Anything beyond that, they need to just release directly to you. That includes personal property because they don't have an interest in that. So in terms of the money that they can control, that is a problem, because we see from a rebuilding standpoint that people will go out and they will sign a contract to rebuild, and they are still working on getting extended replacement cost coverage from their insurance company. And once the work gets completed from the builder, that individual then has to go request that money from their insurance company. The insurance company then sends it to the mortgage company. The mortgage company then has its own requirements about what it needs to release payment. So it's really important, if you can, get your mortgage company involved in the process ahead of time and be very clear about what the obligations are, both from you and from your builder, and make sure your builder is well aware of that. Because what can happen is if, your insurance takes 30 days to pay you, issue you a check, get it to you, then your mortgage company takes 30 days to pay and, verify the work's completed. And then there's your poor builder that hasn't been paid in 2 months, and he has every right to walk off the job. So you definitely want to prevent that from happening if you can.
Thank you so much. And then in terms of underinsurance, why are so many people underinsured? Is it the consumer, or is it the insurance agent? What is the problem, and what might be the best solution?
So it's a combination of issues. The realistic reality is that there's sort of these competing pressures that are placed on the insurance industry. And because the value of what insurance companies can charge is set by the Department of Insurance on a state level, you end up in this sort of situation where the insurance company will make a decision about where they can get the most bang for their buck. We all previously thought, prior to the occurrence of so many disasters, we thought that, okay, well, obviously insurance companies would try and upsell you, because the more money that the more insurance you purchase, the more money they're making, right? But that isn't really the case, because at a certain point in time, for the insurance company, the cost of the reinsurance skyrockets. So they end up that the best place for the insurance industry to insure people is generally below the actual cost of construction in a given area. And that's just something that is standardly true. And secondarily, a lot of insurance companies, after actually in California, this happened after the Oakland Hills fire in the early 90s, where a couple hundred homes were lost in a wildfire outside of San Francisco. And the building industry basically took advantage of the fact that at the time there used to be a product called guaranteed replacement. Because those builders took advantage of this product, guaranteed replacement cost, in the insurance arena, insurance companies did away with guaranteed replacement throughout the United States. So you no longer can purchase guaranteed replacement in almost anywhere. It's really hard to get. If you can get it, get it. But generally speaking, you can't. So you end up in a situation where you're just being provided a policy that gives you a specified dollar amount, but people don't really understand that that dollar amount does not necessarily actually compute to the cost of rebuilding. Most of the time, even if someone is, you know, not severely underinsured, but just underinsured, they're going to be financially insured, meaning if, you know, you took the home the day before the loss and its value and you deducted the value of the land, that would be the value of insurance. It's not enough to rebuild, but it's enough to make you financially whole. Then there are the people who are severely underinsured. And when you see the more severely underinsured people, oftentimes that's because the policies are older, guaranteed replacement was taken away. Sometimes it's a type of policy like we talked about, mobile manufactured homes. I think realistically, to change this, unfortunately, the burden's being put on consumers. We have tried to push this burden back into the insurance industry, but there is just this political fear that the insurance industry will leave a given area if you push too hard. And the truth is that they're, you know, they're one of our monoliths, right? They're like the banking industry. They're too big to fail, you know, so they're going to prevail on this until we either have, you know, a larger federal requirement to adequately insure for a disaster, especially, right, for a total loss, you know, or we have to inform consumers about what it means to be adequately insured and how to ensure that you're adequately insured and continue to be adequately insured moving forward.
Thank you so much for that detailed explanation. In the interest of time, I'll share that we have lots of thank yous for the wonderful information. People think the presentations were fantastic, but we will go ahead and stop now. And all of our speakers have said that they'll accept questions later, so get those questions to us and we'll get them to the speakers. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Nelson. And again, thank you, Meghan and Kendall. And thank you for joining us again for our last webinar of 2020. Check your inbox because we're already planning to rock and roll in 2021. But we would love to hear from you. What issues are coming across your desk? What trainings would help you better serve your clients, especially those impacted by COVID-19? Send me an email and we'll consider doing some of those webinars. I look forward to welcome you back in 2021. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sane, and happy holidays to everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.